Actually, at the Scopes monkey trial, 1925, over here in Dayton, Tennessee. How far is Dayton from here, Steve? About 100 miles, okay. This is what they were going to use as evidence for evolution. The lowest layers are obviously the oldest. Page 275 of the court transcript. No, the oldest layers are not obviously the oldest. Did you know in still water, sediment layers settle out, the bottom one first, and then the second one, and then the third one? That's correct. But in moving water, you can get 5 or 6 or 10 layers to form simultaneously. They form from one end and travel across. So it's possible to have a fossil on the bottom that is younger than a fossil on top, if it's moving water.
But in previous episodes of this series, we've already shown that we're not talking about moving water. In fact, we have evidence directly contradicting that. We're usually looking at a different type of deposition with delicate fossil formations that cannot form except in a still water or even alluvial environment. And the fact that other strata exist on top of such fossils is further evidence against your global flood. Massive floods leave profound evidence of several types everywhere that are entirely different, or would be entirely different than what we're seeing anywhere in the stratigraphic column. The fossil record is obviously not a product of hydrological sorting. Even when there is evidence of a localized flood in a given area, that event is also traceable to a particular period in time. We also have global correlation of index fossils, further confirmed by the occasional interruption of a volcanic eruption, or at least a layer of volcanic ash, showing again that these layers could not have all come down at the same time. Seeing their radiometric ages is just further confirmation of what their physical existence already shows. There is no evidence for the mythical flood of Noah's Ark, but there is profound evidence against it from several different independent fields of study. I'll put a link below to a debunking of the pseudoscience of Noah's Ark by the Physics Department of Southern Methodist University here in Dallas, Texas. I made an 8-part video series myself citing professional scientists and showing how meteorology, geology, paleontology, dendrochronology, zoology, anthropology, archaeology, and even mythology all disprove the myth of a global flood. It couldn't happen, and we know for certain that it didn't happen. Instead, we have proof of evolution and deep time, which I will continue to show as this series continues.
There's a great video tape called Experiments in Stratification. It covers all that if you want more on that. Or get our video number 6. We'll get more of that later.
I watched the cited video, and Stephen Bowman, the geologist I consulted with, mentioned it too. He said what they discovered in that video was cross-bedding, news only to young Earth creationists. He gave me quite a long explanation beyond that, referring to his own research and personal experience. So rather than quote him saying all that here, I will leave it to him to make his own video addressing that one. I'm only addressing this one.
I like to ask evolutionists, I say, guys, your geologic column contains limestone quite a few places. If I handed you a piece of limestone, how would you know if it's 100 million year old Jurassic limestone or 600 million year old Cambrian limestone? I mean, exactly what's the difference? They'd say, well, the only way to tell the difference is by the index fossils. That's precisely my point. They date the layers by the fossils.
If you're a field geologist and you find a layer of exposed limestone, you'd have to get a GPS reading of it and examine the horizons around it to properly associate it with igneous rock above or below it in order to get a radiometric age of it. But if some dolt walks into your office and hands you a chunk of fossiliferous limestone and asks you how old it is, you don't know where he got it, at what level, and what formation. You'd need to see the exact spot for yourself to document and date the strata. Without that, then the only way left is to look at the fossils in the rock. So it is not the circular argument that this preacher makes it out to be. It's also important to note that neither hydrological sorting nor crossbedding could create multiple layers of sandstone like this, with even the appearance of one being from the beginning of the Paleozoic era and another being from the middle of the Mesozoic, like in this preacher's example. This is one of many details that the creationists should explain, but cannot. Believing in a young Earth is much like believing in a flat Earth. There is no working model, and believers know there isn't, but they don't care. They don't want one. They're not trying to figure out what the truth is. They're trying to convince themselves of what they want the truth to be. And sometimes they'll even admit that they already know that what they believe isn't really true. So they don't want a model. They just want to complain about what they call the evolutionary models that they don't want to understand. There is a lot in stratigraphy that creationism cannot account for. For example, I was on a paleontological expedition in South Africa where most of the exposed rock was Permian. So of course all the fossils we found were just what you would expect to find from that period. And the Permian period, and indeed the Paleozoic era, ended with a rare type of volcanic eruption called a flood basalt. We know this because of the Siberian traps, where many successive layers of magma cooled on top of previously cooled layers in stacks many layers deep or many kilometers thick. And these layers cover an area of millions of square kilometers, far bigger than any volcanic eruption humans have ever seen. And remember, there's no fossils in igneous rock for obvious reasons, but igneous rock can be directly dated radiometrically. And those dates tell us that these repeating, pulsating eruptions went on for at least 500,000 years, roughly 250 million years ago. Here's how I describe that event in my series on the systematic classification of life. Although the animals and plants of this world looked very different than the ones we know now, the climate was about the same as what you and I grew up in, until a cataclysmic volcanic eruption began in what is now eastern Russia. This was an extremely rare type of eruption called a flood basalt, where hundreds or thousands of square miles or more can be covered in a vast flood of lava. Successive layers of these floods cover each other, creating a stairway effect called traps, based on the Swedish word for stairs. Eruptions like this evidently occurred maybe a dozen times since then and are often associated with mass extinctions, but none have ever happened in human history. We've never seen anything on this scale. And this one, the Siberian traps, was the biggest and therefore the worst eruption ever in the geologic history of the world. It wasn't just a volcano either, but rather a network of them from a common source, a 20-mile wide crack in the Earth's crust. And this prompted a series of repeated waves of volcanic networks to continue pluming in constant succession for well more than 100,000 years, with each eruption being more massive than anything in human experience, such that an area the size of Australia or the United States was eventually completely covered in lava up to a mile deep. Had it been divided continents like we have today, then the damage wouldn't have been so extensive. But this was back when all the continents were combined into a single supercontinent called Pangaea, and this only provided more fuel for the chain reaction. This worst ever eruption also prompted the worst ever extinction, not from the mile-thick layers of lava, but from the tons and tons of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere. The sulfur dioxide reflects sunlight, causing an extreme chilling effect called a volcanic winter, which is significantly colder and lasts much longer than the normal season. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and so the more of it there is in their atmosphere, the warmer we are. And the way these gases are dispersed globally means that temperate regions could occasionally get colder than Arctic areas. We have the same situation going on right now due to industrial reasons. I recently flew from Iceland to Texas, and it was substantially colder here than it was there. And this combination of atmospheric gases initially caused climate chaos, with decades of intense episodic pulses of oscillating temperature extremes. It also changed weather systems such that normally dry deserts flash flooded and normally lush areas dried out. And this was already enough to kill off many plant and animal species, but this first phase of extinction due to climate chaos occurred during a period of global warming, where the average temperature rose 4 to 5 degrees centigrade above normal. And that doesn't sound like much, and the way temperatures vary day to day in any given location, it wouldn't be much. But we're not talking about any one location. We're talking about the average annual temperature of the entire planet. That's all areas, both hemispheres, in summer and winter, measured over the course of a whole year. At that scale, any change of even a single degree causes a noticeable difference. To put that in perspective, where you are now may be a few degrees warmer or colder than yesterday or the same day last year, and it doesn't make much difference. But the last ice age was a global average temperature of only 4 or 5 degrees colder than it is now. That was enough for most of North America to be buried in glaciers with the sea level 120 meters lower than it is today. So degrees of annual global average are a much bigger deal than your day-to-day local weather. Colder water can retain more gaseous molecules than warmer water. So the warmer the water is, the less oxygen it has. At the end of the Permian, there were primitive sharks and other fish that were as big as whales, and they literally drowned because they needed to get a lot more oxygen through their gills than the warmer water had left in it. Oxygen normally dissolves into surf and is dispersed by the currents at different depths according to the temperature. But when there is no significant difference between the Arctic and the tropics, there's insufficient disparity to drive oceanic currents. And once that stops, the water stagnates. And where that happens, all oxygen is lost. geologists found pyrite in late Permian seabeds. Pyrite, also known as fool's gold, can only form in water where there is no oxygen. So some areas of the ocean were completely dead, or worse, because there are bacteria that only live in oxygen-depleted water, and where some bacteria produce oxygen as a waste product, these anaerobic bacteria produce hydrogen sulfide. There are stagnant bodies of water like this today that are toxic below a certain depth, where the water becomes pink and poisonous. Imagine a whole sea like that. Hydrogen sulfide can also bubble out of the water, causing clouds of toxic gas at the water's edge. And that leads to the third and final stage of this most cataclysmic of all mass extinctions, the release of oceanic methane displacing oxygen in the air. Right now, there is an estimated 30 trillion tons of methane hydrate frozen all over the ocean floor, and it is very sensitive to changing temperatures. Some areas of warm water have streams of methane bubbling up already, but if our oceans warm by another few degrees, all of that could be released into the atmosphere such that vast areas would be choked with air that is flammable but not breathable. Methane is also a greenhouse gas 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So once the oceans warmed by 5 degrees, they boiled up all that methane hydrate, which raised global temperatures by another 5 degrees, or 10 degrees overall. So imagine Arizona at 60 degrees Celsius, which is 140 Fahrenheit. So not only are all the low-lying areas death traps, but high-altitude or high-latitude temperate forests, which never get above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, would suddenly be more than 100. And Arctic regions that should never be above freezing would melt, raising the level of the mostly already dead and still deadly oceans by hundreds of feet. Imagine what our coastlines would look like. And this volcanic travesty is known as the Great Dying, because 70% of all terrestrial animal and plant species and more than 90% of marine species went extinct over a period of 100,000 years or so. This is indicated by geologic layers showing a massive increase of evident temperature correlated with a loss of oxygen, leaving a world that is so barren that very few fossils have been found in that layer of strata now known as the dead zone. Thus began the Mesozoic era of the dinosaurs, which lasted until the second worst but most famous extinction event roughly 180 million years later. And here's how I explained that. The cause is commonly attributed to an impact from space, a comet or meteor about the size of Deimos, the smallest moon of Mars. And this planetoid, called the KT impactor, was 6 to 9 miles in diameter, weighing maybe 120,000 tons, traveling at 20 kilometers a second, or 20 times faster than a rifle bullet. The numbers are incomprehensible in human experience. How could you envision the resulting explosion being 1 billion times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb? It struck the northern shore of the Yucatan Peninsula, less than 100 miles from the famous pyramids of Chichen Itza, where I was just last week. This photo was taken just outside the rim of the Chicxulub impact crater, which was, at the moment of impact, 60 miles wide and 30 miles deep. The scientists initially said that this happened between 65 and 66 million years ago, but their ever-improving estimates now more precisely say that it happened 66,038,000 years ago, give or take 11,000 years. Over that amount of time, the original crater has been filled in and buried by accumulated sediment, but it is still visible in the measurable differences in gravitational fields and in the distribution of cenotes, a network of associated sinkholes like this one, the beautiful Cenote Hubicu in Temazon, Yucatan. Both at the impact site and radiating away from it are quartz crystals showing structural patterns of significant shock from impact. In the surrounding Gulf of Mexico, there is also evidence of the 100-meter-high tsunamis that would have resulted from such a large impact so close to the shore that at least part of it was actually in the water. And the amount of earth displaced would still have caused a substantial tsunami anywhere near the shore. Evidence of this impact is found all over the globe in the form of a layer of iridium dust, which precisely divides the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of the Tertiary period, which is why this is called the KT extinction. Iridium is a relatively rare element on Earth, but one that is notably common in meteors. Yet there is a thin blanket of it all around the world, specifically marking the KT boundary, where dinosaurs, ammonites, and other organisms are found in abundance below that line, but none at all have ever been found above it. We still have fossils, but they're much fewer and noticeably different. Even pollen and plankton show an abrupt decrease both in size and diversity. In fact, 3/4 of all life were wiped out in the days or weeks following that catastrophe. Global temperatures initially spiked as a result of the impact itself, broiling many animals alive for hundreds of miles around. And then the resulting ejecta of millions of tons of vaporized rock were shot into space, where they cooled into liquid spheres and hardened again before plummeting back to the Earth in the form of hundreds of millions of high-velocity bullets, strafing the whole world at once. As a cloud of iridium dust blanketed the planet along with the smoke from the fires and blocking out the sun for weeks or months, killing 60% of all plant species and 75% of animals. This prolonged period of darkness, choked in most areas by unbreathable dust, smoke, and ash, and now suddenly freezing temperatures after the raging fires and torrential storms, was only the final part of this tragedy of connected catastrophes. It wasn't much better in the ocean either, as many different species of marine life were gone. Even some that held on through the Permian Jurassic extinction at the beginning of the Mesozoic couldn't make it through the end of that era. Ammonites, for example, were once among the most abundant organisms around, but not anymore. All the marine reptiles died out too, except for sea turtles, and probably because of the way their eggs are buried in the sand. The only land animals that made it through that event were those that could either hibernate for a long time or had very low demands on energy consumption, or that had some other definite advantage, like, for example, birds were the only dinosaurs to survive, and most of them didn't make it either. Only 2 lineages out of all that were known from that time made it out alive. So in both of these instances, we have substantial evidence of different types: a worldwide iridium layer and a volcanic eruption the size of Australia, neither of which creationists could account for. And they wouldn't even try to explain either one. They would rather simply deny that any of that exists. But this is the reason why there are no dinosaurs other than birds found above the iridium layer caused by the Chicxulub impact. And this is why trilobites are all below the dead zone of the Great Dying.
This textbook shows the kids a trilobite, and it says, boys and girls, trilobites make good index fossils. If a trilobite is found in a rock layer, the rock layer probably formed 500 to 600 million years ago. I don't think so.
If you don't study the subject and instead only follow your biases and consequently have no idea what you're talking about, then it doesn't matter what you think. But the fact is that trilobites have never been found in rock younger than 250 million years.
Somebody found a human shoe print where the guy with a shoe on had stepped on and smashed a trilobite. They asked evolutionists all over, how on earth could a human step on a trilobite? If trilobites lived 500 million years ago, and man didn't get here till, 3 million years ago, and they didn't start wearing shoes till 10,000 years ago, how could a human step on a trilobite? One atheist said, well, it's obviously. The only answer would be that aliens visited the planet 500 million years ago. Oh, them aliens will do it every time. Another guy said, well, maybe there was a large trilobite shaped like a shoe that fell on a small one. Now, there are some big trilobites, okay, but I don't think they're shaped like a shoe.
Of course, the real explanation is that's obviously not a shoe print. It's just an illusion of pareidolia, like seeing animals in the clouds or faces in rock formations. These trilobites were in one layer, and another layer above them was exposed by spalling, a common type of erosion, which in this case bore an oval shape vaguely similar to a sandal print. But you know that's not really a shoe print. You just want to pretend that it is. That's why you have to be careful about creationist claims. Because if the goal is to make believe, then any exaggeration, embellishment, or fabrication will do. For example, a riverbed in Glen Rose, Texas exposed fossilized dinosaur tracks. Because of the way a dinosaur's 3 toes squish into the mud, the resulting fossil track can look a bit like a human footprint, if that human was 15 feet tall. Yet creationists have actually claimed those tracks to be Adam's own footprints. And that prompted an industry of sorts in the town of Glen Rose. In the 1930s, another set of human footprints had been carved out of sandstone by local resident George Adams. And some of these forgeries combined a human track with a dinosaur print, and he sold them as Cretaceous tracks. And these fraudulent tracks were used to convince people that the Cretaceous period happened only a few thousand years ago. And they were shown by a number of fundamentalist groups until the 1970s, when Adams' nephew explained exactly how these forged tracks were made.
Actually, the trilobite has the most complicated eyeball ever. Trilobite eyes are unbelievable. And this is one of the first creatures to evolve, and it already has the most complex eye, which just the eye is one of the most complex features you could have.
Many creationists have the mistaken impression that complexity implies a designer, but if anything, a hallmark of intelligent design should be inefficient simplicity. But that is not what we see anywhere in biology, especially biochemistry, where everything is so unnecessarily, absurdly complex, yet inexcusably inefficient at the same time, suggesting a haphazard incidental configuration. There are a lot of different types of trilobites, with at least 10 taxonomic orders subdivided into several different families, each with multiple genera and more than 20,000 distinct species. And some of the most primitive group had no eyes at all. Others appear to have lost their eyes secondarily. The rest inherited eyes that evolved in 3 variants of one basic type, which isn't shared by any other animal group anywhere.
And trilobite eyes are freaking awesome. Some of them have thousands of individual lenses, and the lenses are made of calcite. They're a crystal. Like the trilobite grew crystals in its eyes. Our eye lenses, they can flex and change size. So if I look at something close up, I focus on it, and I look at something far away, I focus on that. Then the lenses in my eyes are actually changing shape. If your lens is made of rock, that's hard to do.
I mean, different car manufacturers will have headlights that are all interchangeable, or at least they were back when they were all round. But nature doesn't work that way. So eyes evidently evolved at least a half a dozen times independently, following entirely different designs that show multiple patterns of common ancestry. Where an intelligent designer might decide to fit his custom car with LED headlights borrowing some other technology, that never happens in nature. Everything that has eyes has the same kind of eyes that all its ancestors had that had eyes. And this is another evolutionary pattern that creationists cannot account for. Of course, the most primitive species didn't have eyes, and their ancestors didn't have eyes either. And there's a Precambrian precursor called Spraguina flindersi that could be the basal ancestor of all trilobites. But we can't yet say that because the fossils we have don't give a lot of detail. It might be an arthropod, but then it might be a segmented worm or a couple of other Precambrian phyla that went extinct early on. And since we don't really know what it is, then we can't honestly call it a trilobite just because it kind of looks like one.
Now, trilobites are not index fossils for anything, okay? There are all kinds of different types of trilobites, and there probably are some still alive today. Certainly the Baltic isopod is still alive. A guy sent me a couple weeks ago, about a couple months ago, I guess, a whole jar full of trilobites from the Prudhoe Bay water treatment plant up there for the oil factory they've got, oil refining rig. When they arrived in Pensacola, Florida, they were still alive in the jar. But I don't know how to keep a trilobite alive. I mean, you give it mouth to what, some resuscitation, but they all died, but we got them in our museum there.
This from the guy who also said that dinosaurs are literally lizards that got real big. The guy who also thought that whales were dinosaurs. And he thought that the rotting corpse of a basking shark was a dinosaur too. And now he says that isopods are trilobites. No. Isopods are an order of crustaceans like crabs, shrimps, and lobsters. There are thousands upon thousands of different species of isopods, including a suborder that is the only lineage of crustaceans which are fully adapted to life on land. That group is formerly known as woodlice, but as kids we called them roly-polies or pillbugs. Those things crawling around in your garden are not trilobites.
Somebody just sent me a large one that they got down in the Caribbean, about this big. It's in our museum, and it was frozen. They said, yeah, I pulled it off the rock myself down in the Caribbean, still alive. They call it some kind of roach. Roach, it looks like a big trilobite.
It's a trilobite if you just believe that it is. Except that it really isn't. No matter how hard you pretend, that won't make it true. There are some giant roaches indigenous to the Caribbean, and some of the bigger roach species do have a segmented carapace like a trilobite, but that doesn't make it a trilobite. Just like a woman wearing a fur coat doesn't necessarily make her a fox. The trilobites had a variable number of legs, but what set them apart was that their bodies were in 3 lobes, hence the name trilobites. They were not crustaceans nor insects. They were chelicerates, like spiders and scorpions, including sea scorpions, in that their mouth parts had these tiny sets of claws instead of teeth. Roly-polies don't have those. And fortunately, roaches don't either. A lot of arthropods may have a superficial resemblance, segmented shells, as a necessary adaptation for anything with an exoskeleton. But that doesn't mean they're the same thing. Kind of like, if you look back into the 1970s, the Chevy Corvette and the Buick Opal had vaguely similar surface features, but the underpowered Opal was not a Corvette.
This textbook shows the kids a graptolite. It says, boys and girls, this is 410 million years old. I don't think so. Graptolites were found still alive in the South Pacific 10 years ago. So if you find graptolite, you can't use that as an index fossil for any age rock, okay?
According to the British Geological Survey, the pterobranchs that were discovered by Noel Dilley in 1992 are not quite graptolites, but are very similar and almost certainly closely related. There were a variety of different forms in the Cambrian through Carboniferous periods that are different from each other and from the modern pterobranchs. And how they know that some of them are Carboniferous and some of them are Cambrian was confirmed by radiometric dating.
They tell the kids in school the lobe-finned fish is the index fossil for Devonian, 325 million years old. See that short leg, boys and girls? He's got a little bitty leg and then the fin. Ah, see, that proves he's evolving from a leg to a fin. No, that's a lie. The lobe-finned fish are still alive today. They're swimming around the Indian Ocean.
Lobe-finned fish generally refers to a taxonomic class called Sarcopterygii. It's a huge category with many varieties, including some that we always knew still exist today, like the Australian lungfish, also known as the salamander fish. So what was the lie supposed to be exactly? That these fish didn't exist when they clearly do? Or that the lobes evolved into fins? I think they were actually saying that the lobes eventually evolved into legs, and we do have plenty of evidence for that. Here's another lobe-finned fish that we always knew was still alive, although it's from a different order, a cousin of sturgeons. This is a modern Polypterus senegalis, also known as the African biquir. I had one of these as a pet for a decade or so. And not surprisingly, they're carnivorous, an ambush predator that stands on its little legs until it's ready to lunge. So don't keep it with fish that you care about. When I saw it in the pet store, I thought it looked like a lizard fish, a karyotypical transitional species, and it turned out that it was. As I predicted, it's a lungfish. In addition to the buoyancy bladder that teleost fish typically have, polypteriforms also have an asymmetric distension in that, a second bladder that functions as a lung. Because these fish live in shallow, stagnant water with warm, stagnant water with little or no oxygen. So they breathe the air to compensate for that. And the type of lung that they have gives us a good indication as to how lungs evolved. Another interesting feature is that its skeleton has a much higher percentage of cartilage than bone than most teleost fish. And that's not surprising from such a primitive order. The earliest fish were entirely cartilaginous and developed more ossified skeletons later on. I tried to explain ossification to this preacher once before, but somehow he thought I was talking about Lamarckian acquired characteristics. No, we're talking about inherited mutations instead, prompting subtle incremental changes, which then may be naturally selected. So generally, the more primitive species of fish, the higher percentage of cartilage in their bones. Now, given the diversification seen in the Devonian period, also known as the Age of Fishes, with polypteriforms looking a lot like the rest of them, it surprised me that they're not known from the fossil record of that time, not from the Devonian. Instead, polypteriforms are known from the Miocene, and the earliest one ever discovered is from the Upper Cretaceous, about 90 million years ago. The biggest difference being that it's 12 times bigger than the ones we have left today. So I predicted that they would eventually find another older polypteriform or a basal ancestor earlier in the fossil record. They have, but so far their ancestry has been traced to a parent group in the Triassic, not yet as far back as I expected. Now, Linnaean taxonomic ranks are not perfect, to be sure, which is why we've moved to monophyletic clades, but in general there will be multiple species within any genus and multiple genera within a family and multiple families within an order, and here we're talking about multiple orders within a class. Now, while most of the lobe-finned fish from the Devonian period were evidently surface cruising or shallow water types, and we would have known long ago if any of them were still around, coelacanths are deep water dwellers who consequently stayed out of the public eye until relatively recently.
And when they caught the first one in 1938, the scientists looked at it and said, wow, would you look at that? They survived for 325 million years. It never dawned on them once to question the geologic column. That thought never crossed their brain.
Well, we're not stupid. It's not like we saw that some order of fish didn't go extinct when we thought, so I guess we don't know anything, not even everything that we can still prove to be true. And the problem is that this preacher thinks that we think that we evolved from this species of fish. No, No one ever said or believed that.
You don't question the geologic column. It is holy and sacred.
Wrong. As Carl Sagan said, the only truth is that there are no sacred truths. All assumptions must be critically examined. Arguments from authority are worthless. Whatever is inconsistent with the facts, no matter how fond of it we are, must be discarded or revised. We question everything in science, but there comes a point where you can't believe that the world is flat or young anymore because we have so much proof that it is round and really old. There comes a time when you have to accept the reality, regardless what you think that implies about your favorite folklore.
You just have to say it survived for 325 million years. It's in the textbooks today. And they still say it's the index fossil for 325 million year old rock, even though they know they're swimming around the ocean.
Coelacanth is not a species. It's one of a few taxonomic orders of lobe-finned fish, with several representatives in different families. The most primitive of them is a species called Migawashaya burowai from the Devonian period. Rhabdoderma is a genus composed of 8 species known so far, mostly from the Carboniferous period. Coelacanthus here represents a taxonomic family of 5 genera subdivided into 11 species known from the Permian through Triassic periods. And then there are 7 species in the genus Mawsonia, known from the Cretaceous period. So each of these different species of extinct coelacanths are still index fossils for their various time periods. And finally, there was a new genus, Latimeria, discovered alive in 1938. That's one from our time that was never in the fossil record. And a second species from that same modern genus was discovered in 1999.
How can they be that dumb?
Someone who has never studied anything and obviously doesn't know what he's talking about ever thinks that it's all the experts who are dumb. But they're not so dumb as to say that here is a new species so that it's different than the old species, so I guess the old species doesn't count anymore, as if the new one means that the old ones never even existed.
This lady wrote a book about it, A Fish Caught in Time. She says, boys and girls, this is our own great uncle, 40 million times removed. She does look a little fishy, you know, kind of around the gills there. Okay.
Well, it is true that the fish category begins with chordata, or at least vertebrata, animals with spinal cords and backbones, followed by gnathostomata, vertebrates with jaws, and then osteichthyes, which are jawed vertebrates with bony skeletons. And then the group Sarcopterygii includes those with legs and even shoulder bones. Then stegocephalids have all of that, plus feet and toes and a pelvis, all traits that humans still have, and that's why humans still belong to those taxonomic groups that we used to associate only with fish.
You're going to be told that dinosaurs are index fossils for the Jurassic period, 70 million, or Cretaceous, 70 million years ago. That's baloney. Dinosaur bones were found here recently that had blood cells still in them. How long are the blood cells going to last?
The blood cells didn't last. They didn't find blood cells. What they actually identified was ancient heme and hemoglobin breakdown products, compounds derived from blood but that were not actually blood anymore. Because in the fossilization process, original biological material is slowly replaced with heavier chemicals. But vertebrate blood is based on iron, which is pretty heavy already, so nothing is going to replace that. And once the actual blood is gone, what you have left is the iron-based compound called heme. And that's what they found, the iron from the blood, not the blood itself.
Here's soft tissue found with dinosaur bones, still flexible, soft tissue, in March of 2005.
This holy roller doesn't cite actual studies, but the ones other creationists have pointed to describe recovery of what appear to be cells, blood vessels, and tissues, meaning that they have not been confirmed to be that, they just appear to be, or they're traces of that, but not the original material. Understand that calling structures morphologically reminiscent of vertebrate red blood cells does not mean that they are red blood cells. That's just what they call them when they haven't been confirmed. Within the core of large and well-insulated fossils, it is possible to preserve tiny, almost microscopic remnants that still have to be demineralized in an acid bath before they can be called soft or flexible. Tissues are reported as preserved because that's what fossilization does, but it doesn't mean preserving the original chemical composition. One of their citations even says that collagen may be preserved only as breakdown compounds per oxidative deamination, meaning that it was both fossilized and decomposed. Another important fact is that these studies confirmed that the legs of tyrannosaurs were internally structured very similar to that of an ostrich, which isn't surprising since birds are dinosaurs. It's not just that none of the creationist claims about dinosaur soft tissue really are what they make them out to be. More important, I think, should be that this discovery was made by Dr. Mary Schweitzer, who was once a young Earth creationist until she started working in the Paleo Lab. And she is still a Christian, but working every day with proof of biodiversity on an ancient Earth has convinced her of evolution and deep time. So she can be justifiably irritated at creationists who misrepresent her work as if it meant the very opposite of what she knows it to be.